That was supposed to be our anniversary dinner, 7 years of marriage, one simple night where I thought we would finally feel like a family again. But the moment I walked into that restaurant, I knew something was wrong because Daniel wasn't looking at me. He was sitting with his family like I didn't exist, like I was just a guest who had accidentally taken the wrong seat. His mother didn't even try to hide it. She looked me up and down like I didn't belong at that table. And when his father raised his glass for a toast, he didn't mention me once, not even my name, as if I was already erased from their lives while sitting right in front of them. I'm Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night everything I believed about my marriage started to fall apart. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is right now. I read every single one of them. It makes this feel less alone. Daniel used to be different. At least that's what I keep telling myself. There was a time he would hold my hand under the table when his family's opinions didn't seem to matter more than mine. But tonight he didn't even glance at me, not once, as if I was just part of the background noise in his life. I remember sitting there, watching them laugh at stories I wasn't part of, feeling smaller with every passing second, until I finally stood up because staying felt worse than leaving. And that's when I noticed his phone on the table, screen lighting up with messages and documents I was never supposed to see, and something in me froze because I realized this wasn't just about being ignored. It was about being replaced in ways I still didn't understand. The room was loud, but suddenly all I could hear was my own breathing, slow and heavy, as if my body already knew something my mind hadn't accepted yet. That this wasn't just a bad dinner, this was something planned, something intentional, something that had been building long before I ever walked into that restaurant. And when I finally spoke, just one sentence, everything shifted. Daniel's face changed, his confidence cracked like glass under pressure. And for the first time that night, his family stopped laughing. But what was inside those messages that made a man who always controlled every room suddenly unable to speak? And why did I feel like I had just stepped into a truth that none of them were ready for me to see? A truth that was already waiting in the past, in a time before this dinner ever began. What most people do not understand is that what happened at that dinner was not the beginning of my pain. It was simply the moment it became impossible to hide it anymore. Because I had already been living inside a version of my marriage, where I was slowly becoming invisible, long before that night ever happened. And if you want to understand why I stayed as long as I did, you have to understand where I came from, and how I learned to accept being overlooked as something normal. I grew up believing love was something you earned by being useful, not something you were given freely, because in my family everything was ranked, measured, and quietly compared without ever being spoken out loud. My father used to say nothing directly cruel, but silence was his language when it came to me, and my mother had mastered the art of looking away at exactly the moment I needed her to look at me the most. I remember one specific Sunday dinner when I was 14. My brother was talking about his soccer award. Everyone was laughing, passing food around. My father leaned over to him and said how proud he was, while I sat there holding a plate I barely touched because I had just come back from a school science competition where I placed second in the entire district. But no one asked about it, not a single question, and when I tried to mention it later, my mother simply said she thought I would bring it up if it mattered. That was the pattern in our house. Attention was not shared, it was assigned, and I was never assigned any. Even small things followed that rule. My brother got new things while I inherited whatever was left. I remember once asking for a simple desk lamp because I wanted to study at night, and my father told me to use the kitchen light if I needed attention that badly. It was said half-jokingly, but everyone at the table laughed. So I laughed too, because that is what I learned to do. I learned to turn things that hurt into things that were supposed to be funny, so I would not feel them as deeply. When I met Daniel later in life, I thought I had escaped that pattern. He was different at first, or at least I believed he was. He listened. He asked questions. He made me feel like I was finally part of something instead of outside of it. But I did not realize then that people who grow up invisible often choose relationships that recreate the same silence in a different room. The first signs were small, almost unnoticeable. He started making decisions without including me. Family dinners became more frequent than our time alone. Conversations where I used to be included slowly became conversations. I was only present in physically, not emotionally, and every time I tried to point it out, I told myself I was being sensitive, that I should not overthink, because overthinking had always been blamed in my life as the reason I felt things too deeply. I still remember the first time I noticed his family treating me differently. It was during a holiday gathering. I offered to help in the kitchen, and his mother smiled without looking at me and said I could just relax because they already had enough hands. But I watched those same hands include his sister in every detail of the preparation, as if I had already been placed outside the circle without anyone needing to announce it. Daniel did not correct it. He never did. And slowly, I began to understand that silence in a family is not empty. It is a decision. It is a form of agreement. And I was not being excluded by accident. I was being positioned. The shift did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in layers: missed conversations, unanswered questions, plans made after I left the room, and explanations that always sounded reasonable on the surface, until I stopped asking for clarity because asking started to feel like a burden I was placing on everyone else. I did not notice how far it had gone until one night I found myself sitting alone waiting for Daniel to come home from a family dinner I was not invited to, and when he finally arrived, he acted as if it was completely normal, as if I had never been meant to be there in the first place. That was the night something inside me began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing in a house I had lived in my entire life, and I did not yet know it, but that was the moment everything in my world started moving toward the truth. I would later discover at that table, after that night, when I sat alone waiting for Daniel to come home, something in our marriage had already begun to tilt. But what I did not know was that the real fracture was not happening in silence. It was already being built in conversation, in messages I was never meant to see, and in stories that were slowly being rewritten without me inside them. It started with something small, or at least it looked small at first. A notification on Daniel's phone while he was in the shower, a message preview from his mother saying, "We just need to make sure she does not interfere again." And I remember staring at those words without fully understanding what they meant, because, in my mind, I had never interfered in anything. I had only tried to be part of a family that never fully included me. I did not confront him that night. I told myself I would wait for the right moment. But the problem with waiting is that silence always gives space for stories to grow in places where truth is not present. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing patterns I had ignored before: conversations that stopped when I entered the room, subtle changes in tone when my name was mentioned, and the way Daniel started referencing decisions as if they had already been discussed with me, even when they had not. Then came the message that changed everything. It was a group chat I was never added to, accidentally visible on his laptop when he left it open in the kitchen. And I still remember the exact line because it felt like something shifted inside my chest the moment I read it. "Emily is still too close to the situation. We need her to step back before the anniversary dinner, or it will ruin the plan." I did not understand what plan they were talking about, but I understood enough to know I was not part of it. I scrolled further, my hands steady in a way my mind was not, and saw my name repeated over and over in conversations between Daniel and his family. Each message painting me as unpredictable, emotional, and not aligned with what they called family direction. There was even a forwarded email where his mother wrote, "She does not understand her place yet, but she will after Friday." I sat there in complete silence, the kind of silence that feels louder than any argument, because I realized this was not confusion or misunderstanding, it was coordination. They had been building a version of reality where I was already the problem. The most painful part was not the words themselves, but how naturally they fit together, how easily a narrative had been formed around me without my knowledge, turning my reactions into evidence against me. I remember Daniel walking back into the kitchen, asking what I was doing, And I closed the laptop without answering because I knew if I spoke, my voice would shake in a way that would make me look exactly like the version of myself they had described. That night, I lay awake next to him, listening to his breathing, realizing how close deception can sleep beside you without ever revealing itself. And somewhere between fear and clarity, I understood that the anniversary dinner was not just a celebration, it was a setup for something I had not yet seen. And whatever truth they were preparing to reveal about me, I was already standing too close to the edge of losing. Everything I thought was real. After I saw those messages, something inside me never went back to how it was before, because even though I had not been confronted directly, I was already being treated as if I had done something wrong. And that kind of silent punishment is often more damaging than any argument. The next morning, I tried what most people would try in my situation. I tried to talk, I tried to clarify, I tried to understand what I was being excluded from and why. But Daniel left early for work without saying much, and when I asked him later that day about the messages I had seen, he paused for a moment and then told me I must have misunderstood the context. That was the beginning of a pattern that repeated itself every time I reached for clarity and received uncertainty in return. Within a week, I noticed the distance growing more defined, not through open conflict, but through absence. He stopped including me in small decisions, stopped mentioning family conversations altogether, and whenever I brought up the anniversary dinner, he would change the subject as if it carried no importance at all. I started reaching out to his mother, thinking maybe I could fix the misunderstanding at its source, so I called her one afternoon while I was driving back from work. And I remember holding the phone a little tighter than usual when she answered. I asked her directly if there was something I had done wrong, something I could correct, and there was a pause on the other end of the line before she said, in a calm voice that felt rehearsed, that I was imagining tension where there was none, and that I should stop creating problems where there were only family matters. After that call, I sent an email to Daniel explaining everything I had seen, including the messages, the group chat references, and my concern that something serious was being planned without me, and I waited for a response that never came in the way I expected. Instead of answers, I received distance. Instead of explanation, I received silence. Days passed, then a week, and I found myself checking my phone constantly, not because I expected good news, but because I was trying to understand when I had stopped being part of my own life. I even wrote a letter by hand, something I had not done in years, explaining everything as clearly as I could, asking for honesty rather than avoidance, and I left it on the kitchen counter where he would see it when he came home. The letter was never acknowledged. It was simply gone the next morning, and no one mentioned it. That was the moment I realized I was no longer speaking to someone who was trying to resolve a misunderstanding. I was speaking into a system that had already decided not to respond. The emotional weight of that realization did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, in quiet mornings where I stopped asking questions, in dinners where I stopped waiting for inclusion, and in nights where I lay awake, understanding that my presence was no longer part of their narrative. I began to notice how every attempt I made to reconnect only reinforced my position as the problem, because the more I reached out, the more I was met with silence. And silence eventually starts to feel like confirmation. One evening, after another unanswered message and another avoided conversation, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, looking at my phone and realizing that I had sent more explanations than I had received responses, and for the first time, I did not send anything new. I just sat there, watching the screen, and something shifted in me, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that I had been participating in my own dismissal. That night, I stopped waiting for replies that would never come, and instead of reaching out again, I placed the phone face down on the table and decided that if I was going to be written out of a story I never agreed to, then I would no longer beg to be included in it. After that night, I stopped asking for explanations that were never coming, and something unexpected happened. Silence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like space I could finally use for myself. In the weeks that followed, I began rebuilding my life in a way that did not include waiting for approval from anyone who had already decided I did not matter. I focused on work first, because work was the only place where I was still recognized for what I did, not for what I failed to be in someone else's expectations. I started arriving earlier at the hospital, taking extra shifts, volunteering for cases other nurses avoided, not because I needed validation, but because I needed structure, something that belonged entirely to me. My supervisor noticed the change, and one afternoon called me into her office, sliding a small name badge across the desk with my updated title engraved on it. I remember holding it in my hand for a moment longer than necessary, reading my own name as if it belonged to someone I was still learning to become, not someone I used to be. Outside of work, I slowly rebuilt my world in smaller ways. I changed my apartment layout. I replaced old photographs with empty frames at first, not because I wanted to forget, but because I needed space before I could decide what deserved to stay. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came and instead started writing notes to myself, reminders that I was allowed to exist without being evaluated. There was one moment that stayed with me more than anything else. A late evening after a long shift when I walked past a hospital corridor and saw my reflection in the glass of a door marked staff only, my uniform slightly wrinkled, my hair tied back, my badge catching the light just enough to make my name visible. And for the first time in a long time, I did not see someone waiting to be chosen. I saw someone who had already built a place where she belonged. The absence of my family did not feel like loss anymore. It felt like distance I had finally stopped trying to close. Even my thoughts began to change. I stopped asking why I was not enough and started asking what I could build without needing permission. There was no dramatic victory, no single moment of triumph, only accumulation, small decisions repeated daily until they became identity. And yet, even as my life expanded into something quieter but steadier, there was always a part of me aware that the story I had left behind had not finished with me. Because no matter how far I stepped away from it, there were still unanswered threads, still names that had not spoken their last words, still a version of me that existed in someone else's narrative waiting for an ending I had not yet seen. And I did not know it then. But everything I was building in silence was moving me closer to the night I would once again sit at that table, facing the same people who had already decided who I was, except this time I would no longer be waiting for their version of the truth. The days after that dinner did not feel like chaos. They felt like a quiet distance that slowly settled between everything I used to call mine and what I was no longer part of. Daniel stopped calling. His family stopped pretending I was included, and I stopped trying to force myself into spaces where I had already been erased. It was not until a week later that I was asked to return to the same house, not as a guest, but as someone they finally decided to speak to directly. And I remember walking into that living room with a calm I did not recognize in myself, because something inside me had already accepted that the truth was no longer something I was trying to find. It was something I was finally ready to hear. Daniel was there, his parents were there, and for the first time there was no performance of normalcy, only silence that felt heavy enough to sit in the air. His father placed a printed set of emails on the table, the same messages I had once seen fragments of, but now arranged in full context, showing conversations about controlling how I was perceived, about isolating me from decisions, about creating distance before what they called the anniversary situation. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I simply listened as pieces of a story I had been living in began to take shape outside of my confusion. Daniel finally spoke, not with anger, but with something closer to exhaustion, admitting that he had allowed his family's influence to replace his own judgment, that he had convinced himself distance was easier than confrontation, and that I had become collateral in a dynamic I was never fully part of but always affected by. There was no dramatic collapse, no shouting, only the slow realization that what had broken us was not one moment, but a series of choices no one had corrected in time. When it was over, I stood up without waiting for permission, and I told them calmly that I would not stay in a place where my presence required silence from others to feel comfortable. I did not ask for validation. I did not ask for understanding. I simply stated what I needed to say and stepped away from the table that had once defined so much of my life. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, but honest, as if I could finally breathe without waiting for someone to decide I was allowed to. In the days that followed, there were messages I did not respond to, apologies I did not collect, and explanations I no longer needed, because something had shifted in me that no longer required closure from people who had already shown me their limits. I began rebuilding again, not from absence this time, but from clarity, understanding that peace is not found in being chosen, but in no longer needing to be. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and what I learned through everything is that love without respect eventually teaches you how to leave. If you are listening to this and you recognize pieces of yourself in this story, I want you to know you are not difficult for wanting to be seen, and you are not too sensitive for noticing when you are not. Sometimes healing is not loud. Sometimes it is just the quiet decision to stop returning to places where you disappear. Thank you for being here, for listening, for sharing this space with me. And if this story stayed with you, I would love for you to comment where you are watching from and consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for the reminder that you are not alone in what you are feeling. If you would like to continue, there are more stories in this playlist that carry the same kind of truth, quiet, painful, and real, waiting for you to find them when you are ready.